Deep beneath the fields of northern France, inside a corridor that no sunlight has touched since 1944, someone carved a symbol into the concrete wall. It is not a swastika. It is not a Wehrmacht eagle. It is not the double lightning bolt of the SS. Archaeologists who discovered it decades after the war ended could not match it to any known German military insignia, any known Allied marking, any inventory of prisoner graffiti, or any recorded system of Organisation Todt construction codes. They photographed it, catalogued it, and filed it under a category that has grown uncomfortably large over the years: unknown. And that bunker is not alone. From the frozen coast of Norway to the sun-scorched shores of the Mediterranean, from the Channel Islands off the English coast to the deep pine forests of eastern Poland, the concrete fortifications that Germany built across occupied Europe have yielded thousands of markings, carvings, painted symbols, stamped codes, and scratched inscriptions that nobody has been able to fully explain. Some of them are simple enough in origin, but baffling in context. Others are elaborate enough to suggest planning, intentionality, even ritual. A few are so old, etched so carefully into foundations laid during the earliest years of the war, that historians have begun to wonder whether whatever was written on those walls was never meant to be read by an ordinary soldier at all. In this video, we are going to go inside those bunkers. We are going to examine the structures themselves, the people who built them, the soldiers who lived inside them, and the mysteries that have outlasted them all. We will travel the length of the Atlantic Wall, descend into the command bunkers that Hitler used to direct his war, and explore the vast underground complexes that Germany buried beneath mountains and hillsides across its empire. And throughout that journey, we will keep returning to a question that has never been fully answered. Who left those markings? What did they mean? And why do so many of them correspond to nothing in the official record? So, without further ado, let's start at the very beginning, with the wall that was supposed to be impregnable. When Adolf Hitler issued Fuhrer Directive No. 40 on March 23, 1942, he set in motion one of the most ambitious construction projects in human history. The order called for the fortification of the entire European coastline under German occupation, from the tip of Norway's North Cape to the border of neutral Spain, a distance of approximately 2,700 kilometers. Hitler called it the Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall, and he described it in grandiose terms as an impenetrable barrier against Allied invasion. The reality, as always with Nazi mega-projects, was messier, more complicated, and far more interesting than the propaganda suggested. Over the following 2 years, Organisation Todt, the quasi-military engineering corps that had already built Germany's Autobahn network, and the West Wall fortifications along the French border, mobilised hundreds of thousands of workers to pour concrete along every beach, headland and harbour that German strategists judged to be vulnerable. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Atlantic Wall comprised more than 8,000 individual fortifications, ranging from simple open gun pits to massive multi-room reinforced concrete casemates, housing guns capable of firing shells 15 miles out to sea. The sheer scale of what was built is staggering even today. At its peak, Organisation Todt employed roughly 260,000 workers on Atlantic Wall construction alone, and those workers came from every corner of occupied Europe and beyond. French citizens conscripted under the Service du Travail Obligatoire, Soviet prisoners of war marched directly from the Eastern Front, Moroccan and Algerian labourers, Dutch, Belgian and Danish workers, and a rotating population of skilled German engineers and supervisors all contributed to what became a vast, multilingual, multinational construction effort. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, an empire of labour, and like all such empires, it left traces of itself behind in ways that its commanders never anticipated, and its historians are still piecing together. The standard narrative of the Atlantic Wall ends at Normandy. The Allies land, the wall fails to stop them, and within weeks the German defensive line collapses across northern France. But that narrative overlooks something important. The wall was not simply military infrastructure, it was also a human landscape, inhabited for years by soldiers who lived, worked, slept, cooked, wrote letters home, argued, prayed, and in some cases died inside those concrete rooms. And before the soldiers came, the workers who built those rooms left their own marks behind. Understanding the mysterious markings found inside Atlantic Wall bunkers requires understanding both layers of human presence, the builders and the defenders, because the two groups left very different kinds of evidence. The Organisation Todt used an elaborate system of administrative codes to track construction progress, material deliveries, and structural compliance. Casemates were numbered according to a classified system that combined regional prefixes, battery designations, and individual structure numbers. These codes were stamped or stenciled into wet concrete at the time of pouring, creating permanent records embedded in the walls themselves. For decades after the war, researchers assumed that any unfamiliar marking inside an Atlantic wall bunker was simply a variant of this coding system, perhaps from a section of the classified records that had been destroyed or lost. That assumption seemed reasonable until systematic archaeological surveys began in the 1980s and 1990s, when researchers started documenting markings that could not be reconciled with any known version of the OT coding system, no matter how damaged or incomplete the surviving records might be. Some of these anomalous markings were geometric. Some appeared to be stylized letters or runes. A small number resembled nothing so much as pre-Christian Nordic symbols, the kind of imagery that the SS had adopted as part of its pseudo-mystical identity, but rendered in ways that did not match any known SS insignia or heraldic design. What were they? Who put them there, and why in concrete walls that were supposed to serve the purely functional purpose of housing artillery and protecting soldiers? Did someone take the time to carve symbols that had no obvious military meaning? To begin answering those questions, we need to go to one of the most intensively studied sections of the Atlantic Wall, and one of the places where the anomalous markings are most concentrated. We need to go to the Pas de Calais, the narrow strait between France and England where German strategists expected the main Allied landing, and where they consequently built their heaviest and most elaborate fortifications. And within the Pas de Calais, we need to go to a structure that most casual visitors to the region overlook entirely, even though it is one of the largest and most remarkable pieces of military architecture ever built. We need to go to the blockhouse d'Epilec. The blockhouse d'Epilec sits in a forest clearing near the village of Epilec in the Pas de Calais department of northern France, and it is genuinely enormous. Construction began in April 1943 under the direction of Organisation Todt engineers, who were following a design specification unlike anything else being built along the Atlantic Wall at that time. The structure was not a gun casemate or a command post or a barracks. It was a factory, specifically a production and launch facility for V2 ballistic missiles, the world's first operational long-range guided ballistic missiles, which were then being developed under Wernher von Braun at the Peenemünde Research Station on the Baltic coast. The Epilec blockhouse was intended to become the primary manufacturing and launch site for a sustained V2 bombardment of London, capable of producing and firing multiple missiles per day from a location just across the English Channel from the British capital. The scale of the project was extraordinary. At its peak, approximately 6,000 workers were engaged in construction at Epilec, most of them forced labourers drawn from Organisation Todt's vast network of conscripted and slave workers. The structure they were building called for walls up to 5 metres thick in certain sections, a roof of reinforced concrete capable of withstanding direct hits from the largest bombs then available to the Royal Air Force, and an internal volume large enough to house an entire missile production line with overhead cranes, fuel storage facilities, and a railway connection to the main line running through the region. The Germans planned to cover the entire structure with a false hillside of earth and vegetation, so that from the air it would appear to be nothing more than an unremarkable piece of the French countryside. The Royal Air Force disrupted those plans before they could be fully implemented. Beginning in August 1943, RAF Bomber Command subjected Epilec to a series of devastating raids that caused major structural damage and ultimately rendered the facility unusable for its intended purpose. After several months of increasingly costly attacks, Organisation Todt engineers concluded that the Epilec blockhouse could not be made operational in its current form, and the V2 program was relocated to smaller, more dispersed sites that were harder to target from the air. The Epilec bunker was abandoned as a V2 facility and converted to a less ambitious role as a liquid oxygen production plant for V2 fuel. It was damaged again in 1944 and finally abandoned as Allied forces advanced through northern France in September of that year. What the departing Germans left behind and what visitors and researchers have been cataloguing ever since the site opened to the public in the 1970s is a treasure trove of physical evidence from wartime occupation, and at the heart of that evidence, embedded in the concrete itself, are the markings. Some of them are clearly administrative. OT construction codes, material specification numbers, and structural reference marks appear throughout the lower levels of the structure, many of them still legible after 8 decades of weathering. But mixed in with those functional markings are others that resist easy classification. On one interior wall, in a section of the structure that was apparently used for worker accommodation during construction, researchers have documented a series of carved symbols that include what appears to be a stylized sunwheel, a variation on the ancient solar cross that appears in cultures from Iron Age Scandinavia to Bronze Age Central Asia. Beside it, carved by what appears to be the same hand, and at approximately the same time, based on the weathering pattern of the concrete, is a symbol that resembles the Odal rune, one of the characters of the Elder Futhark alphabet that the SS had adopted as the emblem of its race and settlement main office, the Russia. But the version carved at Epilec is subtly different from the standard SS version. The angles are slightly wrong. The proportions do not match. And crucially, it appears in a section of the bunker that was used by construction workers rather than by the SS garrison, which raises an obvious question. Was a forced labourer carving a symbol of their captors? Or was someone carving something older, something that predated the SS adoption of runic imagery by thousands of years? That question is not unique to Epilec. It echoes through the study of Atlantic wall markings like a refrain, and nowhere does it echo more loudly than in the most extraordinary collection of wartime fortifications in the world, the one that stands not on the coast of France or the shores of Norway, but on British territory. We need to talk about the Channel Islands. The Channel Islands, comprising Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, Sark and several smaller dependencies, are a British Crown dependency located just 14 miles off the Normandy coast of France. When German forces occupied them on June 30th, 1940. Following the fall of France and the British government's decision not to defend them militarily, they became the only part of the British Isles to fall under German occupation during the entire war. For Hitler, the propaganda value of holding British territory was immense. For the Wehrmacht commanders responsible for defending the islands, the strategic value was rather more ambiguous, since the Channel Islands were in some respects a strategic liability, tying down a garrison that could have been more usefully deployed elsewhere. But Hitler's orders were clear. The islands were to be held at all costs and fortified to the highest possible standard. What followed was the most intensive fortification program applied to any comparably small area during the entire Second World War. By 1944, the Channel Islands had a higher density of concrete fortifications per square kilometre than any other territory under German occupation, including the most heavily defended sections of the French coast. The islands were covered with gun batteries, observation towers, anti-tank walls, machine gun nests, underground hospitals, command bunkers, troop shelters, and a labyrinthine network of tunnels carved into the granite bedrock. The total volume of concrete poured in the Channel Islands during the occupation period is estimated at approximately 650,000 cubic metres, and the total length of tunnels excavated is measured in kilometres rather than metres. All of this was built using a workforce composed overwhelmingly of forced labourers, including Soviet prisoners of war, Spanish Republican refugees who had ended up in Organisation Todt's labour network, North African workers, and conscripts from across occupied Europe. The conditions under which these workers lived and laboured were brutal even by the standards of the wider OT network. On Alderney, the smallest and most militarily significant of the main islands, Organisation Todt established what amounted to a concentration camp infrastructure, with 4 separate camps housing workers under conditions that numerous post-war testimonies described as deliberately murderous. Workers on Alderney died of malnutrition, disease, overwork, cold and violence, at rates that historians have subsequently estimated at several hundred per year, though the precise total remains disputed because so many records were destroyed before the German evacuation in 1945. What is not disputed is that the labour force that built the Channel Islands fortifications suffered terribly, and that the suffering left traces in the structures they built. Researchers who have systematically examined the interior surfaces of Channel Islands bunkers have catalogued an extraordinary variety of markings that appear to have been left by the construction workforce rather than by the German garrison. Names scratched in Cyrillic script, presumably by Soviet prisoners. dates carved in a style consistent with French or Spanish dating conventions, simple human figures drawn in charcoal, now faded but still partially visible in protected interior areas, and then, appearing across multiple sites on multiple islands, a set of symbols that nobody has been able to definitively assign to any known worker population or cultural tradition. Some of these symbols bear a passing resemblance to characters from the Georgian or Armenian alphabets, suggesting a possible origin in the Caucasus region, where Organisation Todt did recruit some of its Eastern European labour force. Others look like they could be Berber script, which would be consistent with a North African worker origin. But a significant number of the Channel Islands' anomalous markings do not match any known alphabet, writing system, or cultural tradition that researchers have been able to identify, and they appear in some cases to be deliberate, complex, and systematically repeated across different structures on different islands, as if whoever made them was following a pattern that made sense to them even if it makes no sense to us. There is one specific group of Channel Islands markings that has attracted particular attention from researchers. In the tunnels and bunkers of Jersey, which was the most heavily populated of the occupied islands and which consequently has the most extensively documented wartime history, a series of symbols appears on tunnel walls in sections that were apparently used for German military storage rather than for troop accommodation. These symbols are carved rather than painted or drawn in charcoal, which suggests that whoever made them took the time and effort to cut them into hard granite, an act requiring tools, intention, and a significant investment of time and effort. They do not correspond to Organisation Todt administrative codes. They do not match Wehrmacht unit insignia, and several of them have geometric forms that researchers have noted bear a striking similarity to symbols used in pre-Christian Germanic and Nordic religious practice, the same cultural tradition that SS ideologues like Heinrich Himmler and Alfred Rosenberg had mined so extensively for the aesthetic language of their organisation. But the SS was not present in significant numbers in the Channel Islands. The garrison there was Wehrmacht, conventional army soldiers who had no particular connection to SS mysticism. So who carved those symbols, and why did they care enough to do it in granite? One theory, advanced by several independent researchers, is that the symbols were the work of OT supervisors who did have SS connections or affiliations, possibly men who had been posted to the Channel Islands specifically because the fortification program there was considered a showcase project under Hitler's direct personal interest. SS involvement in Organisation Todt was not uncommon at the supervisory level, particularly in projects that Hitler monitored personally, and the Channel Islands fortification program was very much in that category. If OT supervisors with SS backgrounds were responsible for the carved symbols, they would have had both the access to the restricted storage areas where the symbols appear and the ideological motivation to mark a project they considered particularly significant, with imagery drawn from the runic and pagan traditions that Himmler's SS had made central to its self-conception. But this theory has a problem. Many of the Channel Islands symbols do not match known SS iconography any more than they match Organisation Todt administrative codes. They appear to be something else, something that precedes both organisations, and that is where the mystery deepens. The SS, under Himmler's obsessive direction, drew heavily on the work of 19th and early 20th century German and Scandinavian scholars who had studied pre-Christian Germanic religion, runic alphabets, and what they claimed to be the spiritual heritage of the Aryan race. This scholarship was a mixture of genuine philology, romantic nationalism, and outright fabrication, and the symbols it produced were themselves often hybrids, ancient characters given new meanings or combined in configurations that had no historical precedent. The SS adopted this synthetic runic vocabulary as its visual language, stamping it on uniforms, vehicles, buildings, and documentation throughout the period of Nazi rule. When researchers encounter what appear to be runic symbols in wartime German fortifications, the first assumption is naturally that they are SS in origin. But there is another possibility. Some of the symbols being found in Atlantic Wall bunkers, Channel Islands tunnels, and other wartime German fortifications may not be SS-derived runes at all. They may be something genuinely older, something that Organisation Todt's mixed and multinational labour force brought with them from places that the SS ideologues never considered, because those ideologues were looking for an Aryan heritage, and the workers who built those concrete walls came from everywhere, and everywhere left marks. Wolf's Lair sits in a forest in what is now northeastern Poland, about 8 kilometers east of the town of Kętrzyn in the Masurian Lake District. When it was built in 1940 and 1941, the surrounding region was part of East Prussia, German territory since the medieval period, and the site had been selected precisely because it was remote, heavily wooded, and difficult to approach by air. Hitler used it as his primary forward command headquarters on the Eastern Front from June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa was launched, until November 1944, when the advance of Soviet forces made the position untenable. He spent more time there than at any other location during the war years, and it was there, on July 20th, 1944, that Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed the bomb that nearly killed him and changed the course of the war. The complex that Organisation Todt built for Hitler at Wolf's Lair was massive and grew continuously throughout its operational life. The first construction phase, completed in 1941, comprised approximately 80 individual structures, including concrete bunkers, wooden barracks, communications facilities, a power station, an airstrip, and an elaborate system of security perimeters. Later phases added heavier concrete structures as the threat of Allied bombing increased, with Hitler's personal bunker eventually receiving a roof of concrete 8 meters thick, heavy enough to resist even the largest bombs, then in service. The inner security zone of the Wolf's Lair compound, known as Sperrkreis 1, was surrounded by minefields, barbed wire, guard posts, and an anti-aircraft battery. And only a handful of the most senior military and political figures in the Nazi state were permitted to enter it. Despite this extraordinary level of security, or perhaps because of it, Wolf's Lair has yielded some of the most puzzling, anomalous markings of any wartime German installation. The site was partially demolished by retreating German forces in January 1945, and further damaged by Soviet military activity in the months that followed, and it remained a restricted military zone under Polish and then Soviet administration for decades after the war, which means that systematic archaeological examination of the surviving structures has only become possible relatively recently. What researchers have found in the ruins of Wolf's Lair's bunkers is a layered record of human activity that spans the entire operational life of the complex, and within that record, a set of markings that pose questions still waiting for definitive answers. The most discussed of the Wolf's Lair anomalous markings appear in a section of the complex that historians believe was associated with the Fuhrer headquarters communications staff, the highly trained signals personnel who maintained Hitler's radio and telephone links to his field commanders and to Berlin. In a corridor of one of the secondary bunkers in this area, carved directly into the smooth concrete of the interior wall at approximately shoulder height, is a series of symbols that researchers first documented in the early 2000s, during a survey conducted as part of the site's management as a tourist attraction. The symbols are clearly deliberate and clearly made with a sharp metal tool. They are arranged in a line as if meant to be read from left to right, and they include characters that bear a strong resemblance to letters from the Elder Futhark runic alphabet. But the sequence does not spell anything in any known runic cipher or encoding system. It is not a simple substitution cipher using runes for Latin letters. It is not a known SS motto or designation. It does not correspond to any Wehrmacht unit identification system that historians have been able to identify. Several researchers have proposed that it might be a personal message, a memorial inscription, or even a magical formula of the kind that some of Himmler's more eccentric subordinates genuinely believed in. Others have suggested a more prosaic explanation, that a bored signals operator, familiar with runic alphabets from SS training materials that circulated widely in the German military, was simply doodling. But if that is the explanation, why do similar sequences appear in slightly different forms in multiple other locations across the Wolf's Lair complex? And why do some of the characters in those sequences not appear in any known version of any runic alphabet at all? It is worth pausing here to consider the broader context of runic literacy and runic belief within the wartime German military, because it is context that most people do not fully appreciate. Himmler's SS made runes central to its identity from a very early stage. SS rank insignia used runic characters rather than conventional military symbols. The double sig rune that gave the SS its name and its lightning bolt emblem was a specifically chosen piece of Elder Futhark. The Totenkopf, or death's head, that appeared on SS collar tabs had roots in much older Germanic symbolism. SS training materials included sections on runic lore, and Himmler himself was personally fascinated by what he believed to be the spiritual power of runic symbols, to the point of funding excavations and funding pseudo-academic research through the Ahnenerbe, the SS Ancestral Heritage Research Organisation that employed actual scholars alongside dedicated cranks. This runic culture spread well beyond the SS proper. Wehrmacht soldiers were not systematically indoctrinated in runic lore the way SS men were, but they lived in a cultural environment saturated with runic imagery. And soldiers who passed through SS training or who served alongside SS units would have been exposed to runic symbolism in a way that had no real peacetime precedent. Some of the markings found in Wehrmacht bunkers, command posts and tunnel systems may therefore reflect a kind of diffuse runic awareness, rather than specific SS affiliation, soldiers who knew what runes looked like and used them for reasons that ranged from decoration to superstition to simple boredom. But that explanation still does not account for the markings that do not match any known runic system. The characters that appear at Wolf's Lair, at Epilec in the Channel Islands tunnels, and in dozens of other wartime German fortifications include a consistent subset that researchers have been unable to trace to any known alphabet, Germanic or otherwise. These unknown characters are not random scratches. They have consistent forms. They appear to be intentionally made, and in some cases they appear repeatedly across widely separated sites, which suggests that whoever was making them was following a system, even if that system is no longer accessible to us. What was that system? Who created it? And how did it find its way into the concrete walls of fortifications spread across thousands of kilometers of occupied Europe? The Fuhrer bunker beneath Berlin's Reich Chancellery Garden is perhaps the most famous of all the wartime German bunkers, the place where Adolf Hitler spent the final weeks of his life and where the Nazi state expired in a combination of self-delusion, recrimination, and violence. Most people know the basic outline of what happened there. Hitler's refusal to accept defeat, his marriage to Eva Braun on April 29, 1945, his suicide on April 30th. The burning of his body in the Chancellery Garden, and the subsequent suicides and escapes of various members of the inner circle. What is less well known is the physical history of the bunker itself, the layers of construction that had accumulated beneath the Chancellery by the time of its final use, and the traces of human presence that were preserved within those layers until the structure's partial demolition and burial by East German authorities in the 1980s. The Fuhrer bunker was not a single structure, but a complex of interconnected underground spaces that had been built in stages beginning in the 1930s. The original Vorbunker, or upper bunker, was constructed beneath the old Reich Chancellery in 1936, providing air raid protection for government staff. The deeper Fuhrer bunker proper was built beneath the new Reich Chancellery Garden in 1944, providing a more heavily protected space for Hitler's personal use, as Allied bombing of Berlin intensified. By the time Hitler moved his command post from Wolf's Lair to Berlin in January 1945, the combined complex comprised approximately 30 rooms spread across 2 levels, with walls 1.5 to 3.5 meters thick and a roof 4 meters thick, protected by a further 4 meters of earth above the concrete. The bunker was excavated by East German authorities beginning in 1988 as part of urban redevelopment of the Wilhelmstrasse area, and the excavation yielded a substantial amount of physical evidence that was subsequently divided between German archives, museum collections, and, unfortunately, various private collections whose content has never been fully documented. Among the items recorded during the excavation were numerous inscriptions and markings on the interior walls of the bunker complex, some of them made in the final weeks and days of the war, when the bunker was crowded with Hitler's staff, SS bodyguards and various other personnel who had retreated to this last redoubt. Some of those inscriptions are banal: names, dates, ranks, the kind of graffiti that soldiers have always left in places where they have lived under stress and uncertainty. Others are more puzzling. In one section of the Vorbunker, which had been used as staff accommodation during the final siege, excavators documented a series of symbols carved into the plaster of an interior wall. Plaster, rather than concrete, suggests that these markings were made relatively late in the bunker's construction or renovation, and the depth of the carving suggests that they were made deliberately rather than casually. The symbols include a form that resembles the Armanen rune Gibor, which was used by some occult practitioners in the early 20th century as a symbol of the self or of completion, but which was not adopted by the SS and does not appear in standard SS iconography. Beside it is a symbol that some researchers have compared to the Hagalaz rune, the H rune of the elder Futhark, associated with hail, disruption and transformation, which the SS did use in certain contexts, most notably in the double Hagel rune used as a symbol of the SS itself in some early documentation. But the Fuhrer bunker version of the symbol has an additional element, a horizontal bar crossing the central vertical axis that does not appear in any version of the Hagalaz that researchers have documented in SS materials. Were these markings made by an SS member drawing on a personal and idiosyncratic version of runic knowledge? Were they the work of someone in the bunker's final days, perhaps a person who genuinely believed in the magical efficacy of runic symbols and was making a last desperate attempt to invoke some kind of protection or transformation? Were they something older, carried into the bunker by a worker who had participated in earlier construction phases and left their mark before the facility became the inner sanctum of the Nazi state? There is no definitive answer, and the partial demolition of the bunker in the years after the excavation means that the physical evidence no longer exists in its original context. What remains is photographs, measurements, and the ongoing debate about what those markings were trying to say. The Maginot Line, that famous system of French fortifications along the Franco-German border that the Germans famously bypassed rather than breached in May and June of 1940, is often treated as a historical footnote, a symbol of French strategic inflexibility, rather than a subject of serious ongoing study. That is unfair to the line itself and to the researchers who have spent decades examining its physical remains, because the Maginot Line is one of the most extensively documented and most carefully preserved collections of Second World War fortifications in existence, and it has yielded its own share of anomalous markings that add a fascinating dimension to the broader mystery we are exploring. The Maginot Line was built between 1930 and 1936, making it substantially older than the Atlantic Wall and, indeed, older than the Nazi regime itself. Its ouvrages, or works, the large underground fortresses that form the backbone of the system, were engineering marvels of their era, multi-level reinforced concrete structures built to house garrisons of several hundred men, with their own power systems, ventilation plants, kitchens, medical facilities, ammunition magazines, and internal railways. The men who lived in them during the phony war of 1939 to 1940 spent months underground in conditions of extraordinary isolation, and they left extensive records of their presence in the form of inscriptions, drawings, and carvings on the walls of their subterranean homes. Most of these inscriptions are what you would expect: names and dates, regimental designations, political slogans ranging from patriotic to obscene, crude drawings of various kinds, and the occasional piece of genuine art produced by soldiers with talent and time on their hands. But among the French military inscriptions in the Maginot Line's ouvrages, researchers have documented a number of markings that predate the French occupation, or that cannot be assigned to the French garrison on the basis of style, language, or content. This is initially puzzling, since the Maginot Line was built on French territory and was never occupied by German troops in any systematic way, even after the fall of France in 1940, when German forces passed through some sections of the line. The puzzle deepens when you consider that some of the anomalous markings in Maginot Line ouvrages bear a resemblance to markings found in Atlantic wall bunkers built years later by Organisation Todt, using a completely different workforce in a completely different operational context. What could explain the appearance of similar anomalous markings in both the Maginot Line and the Atlantic Wall? One possibility is coincidence or convergent design. The same symbol can appear independently in different contexts without implying any connection between the people who made it. A simple geometric form like a circle with radiating lines can be produced by anyone with a sharp tool and a few minutes' time, without any knowledge of or connection to anyone who made a similar mark in a different country at a different time. Another possibility, more speculative but not entirely implausible, is that Organisation Todt's labour force included workers who had been employed in construction projects in the 1930s, including French military construction projects, and who carried personal marking systems with them from one construction site to another as a way of claiming ownership of their work or communicating with other members of their community within an otherwise faceless and dehumanizing industrial labor force. This was actually a common practice among medieval builders, the stonemason's mark, by which individual craftsmen identified the stones they had cut and the sections of wall they had constructed, has a very long history. It would not be surprising if a similar practice persisted among the labourers of Organisation Todt, especially among communities where literacy was low and other means of written communication were unavailable. And if those workers carried their personal marks from one construction site to another, the presence of similar symbols in pre-war French fortifications and wartime German ones might reflect not SS mysticism or ancient Germanic religion, but something much more human. The ordinary desire of an ordinary worker to say quietly and in a language only they understood, "I was here. I did this. This was mine." Well, that is one theory. But as we move deeper into the most secret and heavily fortified spaces of the Nazi state, the personal marking explanation begins to feel less adequate. Because some of the most carefully documented and most genuinely mysterious markings found in wartime German fortifications appear not in the walls of ordinary bunkers, but in the innermost spaces of the most controlled and classified installations of the entire Nazi military apparatus. And in those places, the markings are too elaborate, too consistent, and too deliberately placed to be explained as the casual graffiti of anonymous workers. Something else is going on. And to understand what, we need to go further in, to the underground complexes that Hitler and his inner circle used not just to survive the war, but to plan it, to direct it, and perhaps, in the final extremity, to escape it. The Norwegian fjords are among the most dramatic landscapes in the world, steep-sided valleys carved by glaciers over millions of years, their walls dropping hundreds of meters from clifftop to waterline in a near-vertical plunge. During the German occupation of Norway, which lasted from April 1940 until the surrender in May 1945, those fjords took on a new strategic significance. They were natural shelters, deep enough and long enough to hide the largest ships afloat, and they were fortified. Accordingly, but it was not just surface ships that the Germans were protecting in the Norwegian fjords. It was submarines, the U-boats of the Kriegsmarine that were waging their campaign against Allied shipping across the Atlantic, and it was for those submarines that Organisation Todt built some of the most remarkable and least visited underground structures of the entire war. The largest of the Norwegian submarine bases was at Bergen, where the Germans constructed a reinforced concrete bunker known as Bruno that could shelter 12 U-boats simultaneously. Similar facilities, though generally somewhat smaller, were built at Trondheim and at Ramsund, but the most interesting in terms of the markings found within them and the mysteries those markings have generated is not the largest or the most famous. It is the facility at Dora, adjacent to the town of Trondheim, where Organisation Todt built what was intended to become the largest U-boat base in the world, a project of such ambition that even by the standards of Nazi mega-projects, it stands apart. The Dora facility at Trondheim was conceived in 1941 as part of a larger plan for Norwegian infrastructure, one that was intended to transform Norway into what the Nazi planners called a model colonial territory, an extension of the Reich that would be permanently settled by German colonists and made productive for the German war economy. The submarine pens were a key component of this vision, providing a secure base from which German naval forces could dominate the North Atlantic and project power against Allied shipping for the indefinite future that Nazi planners were still imagining as late as 1943. Construction began in late 1941 using a workforce of Soviet prisoners of war, Norwegian civilian labourers working under various degrees of compulsion, and skilled German engineering personnel. The project continued until late 1943, when Allied bombing and the increasingly desperate overall situation began to redirect Organisation Todt's resources toward more pressing priorities. What was built at Dora before construction halted is impressive, even in its incomplete state. The main submarine hall comprises 7 reinforced concrete pens, each large enough to shelter a Type 7 U-boat, which was the standard Atlantic operational submarine of the Kriegsmarine. The hall is covered by a concrete roof approximately 4 meters thick, and the walls between the individual pens are over 3 meters of reinforced concrete. The facility includes workshops, torpedo storage areas, crew accommodation, and a dry dock section where submarines could be lifted out of the water for maintenance and repair. In its completed form, as planned, Dora would have been the most powerful submarine facility in the world, capable of sheltering, maintaining, and supplying an entire U-boat flotilla. The workforce that built Dora paid a terrible price for their labour. Soviet prisoners of war, who formed the largest single component of the construction workforce in the early phases, died in large numbers from malnutrition, exposure, disease, and abuse. Norwegian civilian workers, while generally better treated than the Soviet prisoners, also suffered significant hardship. The combination of brutal conditions, multilingual workforce, and the physically demanding nature of the work created exactly the kind of environment in which workers throughout history have left marks of their presence, testimony in stone and concrete that their labour, their suffering, and their existence would not be entirely erased when the project was complete, and they were moved on to the next site or the next phase of their captivity. The markings at Dora fall into several distinct categories. The most numerous are simple graffiti in Cyrillic script, names and dates scratched into the concrete during construction, the kind of memorial inscription that Soviet prisoners appear to have made wherever they could throughout. Their captivity in the German forced labour system. These are heartbreaking in their simplicity: a name, a date, sometimes a hometown, occasionally a sentence expressing hope of return or acceptance of death. Researchers who have worked on the Dora site have translated many of these Cyrillic inscriptions and found that a significant number of them correspond to names and places in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarusia that were devastated by the German invasion, and that many of the men who carved those names never returned to the places they wrote about. But alongside the Cyrillic inscriptions, and clearly made by different hands, are a series of markings that have proved much more difficult to interpret. In the workshop section of the Dora facility, which was used by German naval personnel for submarine maintenance and repair, rather than by the construction workforce, researchers have found a consistent set of symbols carved and painted on the interior walls of several rooms. These symbols are identifiable: the Kriegsmarine Eagle, various submarine flotilla insignia, and standard German military administrative codes, but others are not. A recurring symbol that appears in at least 4 separate locations within the workshop section has been described by different researchers variously as a stylized anchor, a variant of the wire rune that was sometimes used as a symbol of death, and a form that bears a resemblance to a symbol associated with the pre-Christian Norse concept of Yggdrasil, the world tree of Norse mythology. None of these interpretations is entirely convincing, and none of them has achieved scholarly consensus. What everyone agrees on is that the symbol appears too consistently and in too deliberate a manner to be random, and that it does not match any known Kriegsmarine insignia or any documented symbol used by the U-boat arm of the German Navy. The German submarine service, the U-Boot-Waffe, had its own elaborate culture of insignia and personal marking. Individual U-boats carried distinctive emblems on their conning towers, ranging from simple geometric forms to elaborate animal designs and patriotic imagery, and these conning tower insignia were chosen by the boat's commander and crew and carried deep personal significance for the men who served under them. The U-boat bases also accumulated a rich material culture, with walls painted by skilled artists, sculptures made by talented sailors during port calls, and a general atmosphere of intense community identity that was in some ways a response to the extreme psychological pressure of submarine service. In this cultural environment, the appearance of unusual or idiosyncratic markings in workshop spaces is not inherently surprising. What is surprising is the consistency of the specific unknown symbol at Dora, its appearance in multiple locations within a restricted workshop area, and its apparent absence from any equivalent documentation at other U-boat bases, despite the fact that the same flotillas and some of the same personnel operated from multiple bases throughout the war. Moving south from Norway to the coast of Brittany in occupied France, we encounter a different kind of submarine base and a different kind of mystery. The port of Lorient in the Morbihan department of southern Brittany was the most important U-boat operational base on the French Atlantic coast for much of the war. From Lorient, U-boats of the 2nd and 10th flotillas sortied into the Atlantic to attack the convoys that were the lifeline of Britain's war economy, and it was to Lorient that the surviving boats returned after weeks or months at sea, their crews exhausted and depleted by the grinding attrition of the Battle of the Atlantic. Organisation Todt began constructing the Lorient submarine base, known as Keraman, in early 1941. and by the end of that year had completed the first 3 pen complexes that form the backbone of the facility. Construction continued through 1942 and 1943, eventually producing a facility that could shelter 30 U-boats simultaneously behind roofs of reinforced concrete up to 7 meters thick. Lorient was so heavily bombed by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces during 1942 and 1943 that the surrounding town was almost completely destroyed, an irony made all the more bitter by the fact that the submarine pens themselves survived the bombing largely intact, their massive concrete roofs deflecting everything the Allies threw at them. This disproportion between the destruction of the civilian town and the survival of the military objective made Lorient a symbol of the limitations of strategic bombing in the early war years, and it ensured that the Karaman facility remained operational until the very end of the war, when the Lorient Pocket, a surrounded German garrison that refused to surrender until May 10, 1945, finally capitulated 2 days after the general German surrender. Karaman submarine pens at Lorient have been more extensively studied than almost any other wartime German installation in France, partly because of their iconic status in the history of the Battle of the Atlantic, and partly because they have been open to researchers and visitors since the 1990s. That extended period of study has produced an unusually rich body of documentation of the markings found within the pens, and it is within that documentation that one of the most intriguing clusters of anomalous markings has been recorded. In the dry dock areas of the Karaman 3 pen complex, the most heavily fortified and most recently constructed section of the facility, researchers in the early 2000s documented a series of symbols on the interior walls of a maintenance gallery that was accessible only to German naval personnel, not to the civilian workforce that serviced other parts of the facility. The symbols are painted rather than carved, suggesting that they were applied relatively quickly and possibly under time pressure, but they are complex enough to suggest that whoever painted them knew exactly what they were drawing. They include a series of interlocked geometric forms that several independent researchers have independently compared to diagrams associated with Himmler's Ahnenerbe research program, specifically to the geometric schemas used in SS studies of pre-Christian Germanic sacred geometry. But the Ahnenerbe materials are difficult to access, most of them having been captured by the Allies in 1945 and subsequently divided between various national archives, and the comparison is therefore hard to verify conclusively. What can be said is that the Lorient markings, like the Dora markings, the Wolf's Lair markings, and the Channel Islands markings, represent a consistent phenomenon across widely separated sites. The presence of symbols that do not match any known military or administrative coding system, but that appear to have been made deliberately and intentionally in restricted or specialized spaces by people who had some specific reason to mark those spaces in that particular way. The geographical spread of similar anomalous markings across the entirety of the German military's physical footprint in Europe suggests that this was not an isolated or local phenomenon, but something more systematic, more widespread, and more deeply embedded in the culture of the Nazi state than any simple explanation can account for. And this brings us to perhaps the most extraordinary and least understood of all the underground sites associated with the wartime German state, the complex known as Riese, which is German for giant, a project so vast, so strange, and so incompletely documented that it remains one of the great mysteries of the Second World War even today, nearly 80 years after the workers who built it were marched away and left it to the forest and the rain. The Riese complex is located in the Owl Mountains of Lower Silesia, in territory that was part of Germany during the war and is now part of southwestern Poland, in the area between the towns of Wałbrzych and Nowa Ruda. Construction began in 1943 under conditions of extraordinary secrecy, with Organisation Todt and SS-controlled construction units operating under orders that forbade any disclosure of the project's purpose, location, or dimensions to unauthorized personnel. The workforce was composed almost entirely of concentration camp prisoners, mainly Jews from various European countries transported to the area by the SS, along with prisoners of war and forced labourers from Poland and other occupied territories. The conditions under which these prisoners worked were by all accounts among the worst in the entire forced labour system, and the death rate among the Riese construction workforce was catastrophic, with estimates of the total number of deaths ranging from several thousand to more than 10,000, though the destruction of records makes any precise figure impossible. What Organisation Todt and the SS were building in the Owl Mountains was an underground complex of enormous scale, comprising multiple interconnected tunnel systems, reinforced chambers, and rail connections spread across an area of several square kilometres. The tunnels were carved directly into the granite of the mountain range, using explosives and hand drilling, and by the time construction was halted in late 1944 as Soviet forces approached, the complex had consumed an estimated 8 million cubic metres of excavated rock and an equally extraordinary quantity of concrete, steel, and other construction materials. The purpose of the Riese complex has never been definitively established, because no documentation of the project's official functions survived the war, having been either deliberately destroyed by retreating German forces or lost in the chaos of the final months. Various theories have been advanced over the years. An alternative Fuhrer, headquarters to replace Wolf's Lair, an underground armaments factory, a facility for the development of secret weapons, a repository for looted art and treasure, or some combination of all of these. None of these theories has been proved, and none has been disproved. What has been established through systematic archaeological survey beginning in the 1990s is that the Riese complex contains some of the most extensive and most carefully made anomalous markings of any wartime German underground installation. The tunnels have been surveyed metre by metre in some sections, with every marking photographed, catalogued and analysed, and the resulting dataset is both extraordinary and deeply puzzling. The vast majority of the markings are straightforwardly identifiable. Organisation Todt construction codes, SS administrative numbers, engineering measurements and specifications, and the inevitable personal inscriptions left by prisoners who found moments of privacy in which to record their names and their suffering. But there is a third category, substantial enough to be statistically significant and distinctive enough to be immediately recognisable, of markings that correspond to none of these categories and that have resisted every attempt at systematic identification. These anomalous Riese markings share several characteristics that set them apart from both the administrative codes and the prisoner graffiti. They tend to appear in specific locations rather than being randomly distributed throughout the tunnel system, at junctions, at points where the tunnel geometry changes significantly, and at the entrances to the largest and most elaborately constructed of the underground chambers. They are executed with a consistency of form that suggests they were made by a small number of people following a shared convention, rather than by many different individuals working independently. And several of them incorporate elements that researchers have identified as derivatives of pre-Christian Germanic sacred geometry, the same tradition that the SS Ahnenerbe investigated extensively, though the Riese versions appear in configurations that do not match any documented Ahnenerbe schema. One group of Riese markings has attracted particular attention from researchers over the years because of where they are found and what they appear to be doing. At the entrance to the largest of the Riese underground chambers, a space roughly 150 metres long, 40 metres wide, and 12 metres high, which researchers believe may have been intended as the principal functional space of whatever the complex was meant to be, there is a series of markings carved into the granite of the doorway surround. They appear to form a deliberate arrangement, symmetrically placed on either side of the entrance and at specific heights above the floor, as if they were intended to frame the passage through the doorway in a particular symbolic relationship. The individual symbols in this arrangement include forms recognizable as Algiz runes and Sowilo runes, both characters of the Elder Futhark with known meanings in Germanic runic tradition, but they also include forms that do not correspond to any character in any known runic alphabet. These unknown forms are more elaborate than the standard runic characters, with multiple internal lines and geometric subdivisions that give them the quality of diagrams rather than letters, and they are carved more deeply and more carefully than the standard runic characters around them, suggesting that whoever made them considered them more significant. The Ahnenerbe connection at Riese is speculative but worth examining, because if any wartime German project was likely to attract the personal interest of Heinrich Himmler, and therefore the involvement of his Ahnenerbe researchers, it was a massive, secret underground complex built with SS-controlled labour in the heart of the Germanic homeland of Silesia. Himmler was deeply invested in the idea of a Germanic sacred geography, a landscape marked by ancient power centres and connected by invisible lines of force that the ancestral Aryan race had recognised and utilised in the prehistoric past. This was not mainstream SS doctrine, which was a more mundanely racial and administrative affair, but it was very much Himmler's personal obsession, and he had the power to translate personal obsessions into institutional action. If Himmler's Ahnenerbe personnel were involved in the Riese project, even at the margins, they might well have marked significant structural points with symbols from their research, both as a form of ritual consecration and as a way of encoding information about the site in a medium that ordinary soldiers and construction workers would not be able to read. This hypothesis cannot currently be confirmed or refuted because the Ahnenerbe records that survive, while substantial, are incomplete, and the specific documentation of any Ahnenerbe involvement with the Riese project has never been found. What remains is the physical evidence in the tunnels themselves, the markings that someone made in granite that has now outlasted everyone who knew what those marks were for. From Riese, we travel back north and west to a project that is in some ways even more mysterious, because at least at Riese we know that a major construction effort took place. The complex known as Amt Zeppelin, located near Zossen in Brandenburg, approximately 40 kilometers south of Berlin, was the most important communications center of the entire German war machine, the nerve center through which the Wehrmacht's general staff maintained contact with field commanders across every theater of the war. What is less well known is the extraordinary extent of the underground infrastructure that was built beneath and around Amt Zeppelin, and the degree to which that infrastructure has remained inaccessible to systematic study even decades after the war's end. The Zossen complex began as a conventional military headquarters facility in the 1930s, comprising a number of above-ground buildings and bunkers in the forested countryside south of Berlin. As the war progressed and Allied bombing of German cities intensified, the Wehrmacht invested increasingly heavily in underground expansion of the facility, ultimately creating a network of interconnected bunkers and tunnels beneath the existing above-ground structures that could shelter the entire general staff in reasonable security and comfort. The underground sections of Amt Zeppelin were equipped with the most advanced communications technology available, including the Lorient cipher machines that encrypted the Wehrmacht's most sensitive communications, the landline networks that connected Berlin to every major headquarters in the German military system, and the radio facilities that maintained contact when landlines were cut. The Zossen complex also contains in its underground sections some of the most puzzling anomalous markings in the entire catalogue of wartime German installations. The access restrictions that were applied to Zossen under both East German and Soviet administration, which effectively sealed the complex from independent study for nearly 50 years, mean that detailed documentation of its interior began only in the 1990s, and much of the underground section remains inaccessible or inadequately surveyed even today. But what researchers have been able to document includes a category of markings in the communications galleries, the corridors housing the cables and equipment through which the Wehrmacht's communications flowed, that have the same characteristics as the anomalous markings found at other sites: deliberate, consistent, not matching any known administrative or military coding system, and incorporating elements of runic or pre-Christian Germanic symbolism in configurations that do not correspond to known SS iconography. The communications galleries at Zossen are a particularly interesting location for anomalous markings because of the nature of the work conducted there. The Lorentz cipher machines, which the Germans considered unbreakable, were in fact broken by the British at Bletchley Park beginning in 1941, giving Allied codebreakers access to a substantial proportion of the Wehrmacht's most sensitive communications throughout the remainder of the war. The Germans never discovered that their communications had been compromised, and the personnel who maintained the cipher systems at Zossen presumably continued to use them in the belief that they provided absolute security. But the British ability to read German Lorentz encrypted communications was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire war. So closely guarded that even now, decades after declassification, there are aspects of what the British knew and when they knew it that have not been fully documented in the public record. In this context, the anomalous markings in the Zossen communications galleries acquire an additional possible layer of significance. Is it conceivable that some of them are not SS mysticism, not worker graffiti, not administrative coding variants, but something more functional? Is it possible that they represent a private communication system of some kind, a way of encoding or indicating information within the physical fabric of the installation itself, in a medium that an enemy who had broken the cipher systems could not access? This is speculative, but the history of intelligence and counterintelligence during the Second World War is full of innovations precisely this creative, precisely this paranoid, and precisely this impossible to verify without documents that have not yet been found or may no longer exist. The Berghof, Hitler's personal retreat in the Bavarian Alps above the town of Berchtesgaden, is one of the most iconic locations of the Nazi era, the place where Hitler received foreign dignitaries, where Neville, Chamberlain came in 1938 to negotiate the agreement that surrendered Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland to Germany, and where the Nazi leadership gathered for the informal summits and discussions that supplemented the formal machinery of the Wehrmacht and the party. What is less well known about the Berghof and its surroundings is the extraordinary extent of the underground and defensive infrastructure that was built into the mountains around it during the war, a network of tunnels, bunkers, and protected spaces that transformed the entire Obersalzberg Plateau into one of the most heavily fortified areas in Germany. The Obersalzberg tunnel system, built by Organisation Todt between 1943 and 1945 as the Allied bombing threat to Germany intensified, comprises approximately 4 kilometres of interconnected tunnels and dozens of individual protected spaces, ranging from simple blast shelters to fully equipped accommodation suites for senior Nazi officials. The tunnels were carved into the solid rock of the mountain at depths of between 10 and 50 metres, and they were connected to the surface buildings, including the Berghof, by stairs and elevator shafts that allowed the occupants to descend quickly in the event of an air raid alarm. The system was never completed at the time of the American advance in April 1945, and the SS garrison burned and partially demolished the above-ground structures before retreating, but the tunnels themselves survived largely intact. The Obersalzberg tunnels have been open to visitors since the construction of the documentation centre that now occupies the site, and they have been systematically surveyed. Among the most interesting findings of that survey is a cluster of markings in a section of the tunnel system that is believed to have been associated with the personal quarters designated for Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful private secretary and the effective ruler of the Nazi Party apparatus in the final years of the war. Bormann was known to have deep personal roots in the Obersalzberg community, having developed the plateau as Hitler's retreat in the 1930s and having maintained his own residence there throughout the war. The tunnel section associated with his quarters contains, in addition to the expected administrative markings and minor personal inscriptions, a series of symbols that researchers have identified as unusual. Several of them incorporate combinations of runic characters that do not correspond to any known SS emblem or designation, but that bear a strong resemblance to configurations found in the Armanen rune system, developed by Guido von List, an Austrian occultist of the early 20th century whose work was enormously influential on the development of SS runic ideology, even though List himself died in 1919 before the SS existed in its mature form. The Armanen runes were not an ancient system. They were invented by von List based on his own claimed mystical experiences and his creative reinterpretation of the Elder Futhark, and they differ from the Elder Futhark in specific ways that are recognizable to anyone who has studied both systems. The appearance of what appear to be Armanen-derived symbols in the Berghof tunnel system, in a location associated with Bormann, is interesting because Bormann himself was not known as an occultist or as someone particularly interested in runic mysticism. That was Himmler's domain. Bormann's power came from his administrative control of access to Hitler and from his masterful manipulation of the Nazi Party's bureaucratic machinery. He was, by all accounts, a man of intensely practical rather than mystical orientation. So if the markings in his tunnel section do incorporate Armanen-derived symbols, who put them there and why? One possible answer involves the nature of the Obersalzberg as a space. The plateau and the mountains around it had been associated with German Romantic nationalism since the 19th century, and the region's folklore included various traditions concerning sacred or powerful sites in the local landscape. Organisation Todt's workforce at Obersalzberg included local Bavarian workers alongside the usual complement of forced labourers from across occupied Europe, and the local workforce might have had access to local traditions of sacred geography that expressed themselves in the marking of significant underground spaces. This is not a provable hypothesis, but it is worth noting that the Alpine regions of Germany and Austria were precisely the areas where 19th century occultists like Guido von List had developed their theories of Aryan sacred geography, drawing on local folklore and landscape tradition. The same impulse that produced von List's Armanen system might also have produced locally specific marking traditions that survived into the wartime period among workers who retained a connection to the pre-modern landscape culture of the region. The Monte Sorati bunker, the complex located about 50 kilometers north of Rome in the volcanic hills of Lazio, offers a completely different geographical and cultural context for the mystery of anomalous markings, and in some respects, a more straightforwardly answerable one, though the answers it provides raise as many questions as they resolve. Monte Sorati is an isolated rocky outcrop rising sharply from the flat Tiber plain, and its height, visibility, and natural defensibility made it strategically important to every military force that has operated in central Italy throughout recorded history. The Romans used it, the medieval papacy used it, and in 1942 the Germans began tunneling into it to create an underground headquarters facility for Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the commander of German forces in Italy. The Monte Sorati complex was built over approximately 2 years by a workforce that included Italian civilian labourers, Organisation Todt personnel, and some German military engineers. By the time of the Allied landings at Anzio in January 1944, it was a fully functional underground headquarters with communications facilities, accommodation for senior staff, a power station, and the other infrastructure necessary for prolonged use as a command centre. Kesselring used it intermittently throughout 1944 before the Allied advance through central Italy made it untenable. German forces abandoned Monte Sorati in the summer of 1944 as Rome fell to the Allies, and the complex subsequently served various Italian military purposes before eventually being opened partially to visitors. The anomalous markings at Monte Sorati are interesting, not because they are the most elaborate or the most numerous found in any wartime German installation, but because of the cultural context in which they appear. The Italian workers who laboured on the Monte Sorati project brought with them a completely different set of cultural traditions from the Northern European or Eastern European workers who built the Atlantic Wall or the Riese complex, and the Italian tradition of sacred landscape, which includes a very long history of marking significant sites with protective symbols, is both better documented and more readily traceable than the Germanic runic tradition. Researchers who have examined the Monte Sorati markings have identified several symbols that appear to belong to the Italian folk tradition of apotropaic or protective magic, a tradition with roots stretching back to the Roman period and beyond. These symbols, which Italian workers may have carved as protective gestures in the dangerous underground environment, are not mysterious in origin, but they are anomalous in the context of a German military installation, and they represent a category of anomalous marking that is easy to overlook. The evidence of the spiritual and cultural practices of workers who came from traditions the German military authorities neither understood nor cared about, and who expressed those practices quietly in the fabric of the structures they were forced to build. This raises a question that gets to the heart of what we are really dealing with when we talk about anomalous markings in wartime German fortifications. Are we dealing with a genuine mystery, a set of symbols whose origin and meaning are truly unknown? Or are we dealing with a documentation gap, a situation where the symbols have perfectly comprehensible origins in the cultural traditions of the people who made them, but where those traditions are unfamiliar to the primarily German and Northern European researchers who have studied the sites? The answer, almost certainly, is both. Some of the anomalous markings have cultural origins that could be identified with sufficient knowledge of the relevant traditions, whether those are Ukrainian protective symbols, Berber script, Italian folk magic, or any of a dozen other cultural vocabularies that might have been represented in Organisation Todt's enormous and diverse labour force. But others, particularly the most consistently repeated and most carefully executed symbols in the most restricted and significant locations, genuinely resist this kind of cultural identification. They appear to belong to a system that was private, internal, and apparently specific to the wartime German military apparatus, rather than to any of the subject populations it forced to labour for it. And those are the markings that keep researchers coming back year after year to the bunkers and tunnels of the Nazi state. Not the heartbreaking Cyrillic inscriptions of Soviet prisoners, not the Italian folk symbols of frightened construction workers, not even the familiar runic emblems of the SS. What draws researchers back is the small but consistent set of symbols that appear in restricted military spaces, in elaborate configurations, in locations that suggest intentionality and purpose, and that correspond to nothing in any catalogue of known military, administrative, cultural, or religious symbolism. What are those markings? In the next phase of our investigation, we are going to go deeper into the specific sites where they appear most concentratedly, and we are going to follow the evidence as far as it goes, even when it leads to conclusions that are deeply uncomfortable. The West Wall, which the Allies called the Siegfried Line, was the German defensive fortification system running along Germany's western border from the Netherlands in the north to Switzerland in the south. Unlike the Atlantic Wall, which was a wartime construction built in occupied territory, the West Wall was built on German soil, beginning in 1936 when the Rhine had been remilitarized and completed in the years immediately before the war. It was also, unlike the Atlantic Wall, a project that drew heavily on German civilian labour, rather than on the forced labour of occupied peoples, at least in its initial phases. The men who built the early West Wall were German. Workers employed under the direction of the Reich Labour Service, the Reichsarbeitsdienst, and they worked in conditions that, while often hard, were nothing like the murderous circumstances of the later Organisation Todt projects in occupied Europe. This difference in workforce composition creates a different set of questions about the anomalous markings found within West Wall bunkers, because if those markings were made by German workers rather than by forced labourers from occupied territories, the cultural traditions they reflect are necessarily different. The West Wall comprises approximately 3,000 individual fortifications spread across 500 kilometres of border terrain, ranging from simple concrete anti-tank barriers, the famous dragon's teeth that still line sections of the Belgian and German border today, to elaborate multi-room bunkers housing machine gun positions, artillery pieces, and troop accommodation. The quality and elaborateness of the construction varies considerably along the line, reflecting both the priority given to different sections and the evolving standards of Organisation Todt as the programme progressed. The most heavily fortified sections are those facing the Saarland and the Palatinate, where the German military planners expected the most serious French offensive effort, and it is in these sections that the most interesting West Wall bunkers and the most interesting West Wall markings are concentrated. The bunkers of the West Wall Saar section were built primarily in 1938 and 1939, in a crash programme that mobilised hundreds of thousands of German workers in the most intensive peacetime construction effort the country had ever seen. Those workers, far more than the forced labourers of the Atlantic Wall, were engaged in the ideologically charged project of building the physical border of the German homeland, and they were told repeatedly by Nazi propaganda that they were participating in a historic act of national defence. The ideological atmosphere of the West Wall construction programme was therefore considerably different from that of the Atlantic Wall. Workers on the West Wall were not performing forced labour in an occupied country. They were, as far as they understood it, building the fortress of the German nation. In that atmosphere, the impulse to mark one's contribution to the national project, to leave a personal inscription within the structure of the national fortress, was probably stronger than in any other wartime construction context. This context helps explain why the West Wall bunkers contain a particularly rich and varied collection of worker inscriptions, but it does not fully explain the anomalous markings that appear within them, alongside the expected personal graffiti and administrative codes. Those anomalous markings in the West Wall share characteristics with the markings found in later Atlantic Wall and Eastern European installations, which raises a difficult question about chronology. Did the West Wall markings influence the later Atlantic Wall markings, suggesting that OT supervisors or other personnel who had worked on the West Wall brought their marking practices with them to the Atlantic Wall? Or did both sets of markings reflect an underlying tradition that preceded both construction projects, something embedded in the culture of German military construction that expressed itself wherever large numbers of German military construction personnel gathered? To explore that question, we need to look at what may be the single most concentrated cluster of anomalous markings in any wartime German fortification, a cluster that appears not in any of the famous or frequently visited sites we have examined so far, but in a small and largely unknown West Wall bunker complex in the Saar region that was surveyed in detail by a team of German and French archaeologists beginning in 2007. The complex, which for reasons that will become clear has not been publicly identified in the research literature, comprises 7 interconnected concrete structures built in 1938 and 1939, that formed a self-contained defensive position on a wooded hillside. It was never significantly used in combat, since the German offensive of May 1940 bypassed the Franco-German border entirely, and it was subsequently abandoned by the Wehrmacht, used briefly for storage by German occupation authorities, and then forgotten for decades until local historians stumbled across it in the 1990s. The archaeological survey of this complex revealed approximately 200 individual markings on the interior surfaces of the 7 structures, of which roughly 140 could be classified with reasonable confidence. Administrative codes, personal inscriptions, conventional military unit markings, and the standard engineering reference marks used by West Wall construction engineers. The remaining 60 or so markings fell into the category that the survey team described with deliberate academic caution as unclassified. These unclassified markings were concentrated in 2 of the 7 structures, specifically in the structures that had served as the command post and communications room of the complex, and they bore the characteristics that by now will be familiar from our examination of other sites: deliberate execution, consistent form, geometric complexity, and similarity to, but not identity with, known runic characters. The survey team made an important observation about this cluster of West Wall anomalous markings that has not received the attention it deserves. Several of the symbols in the command post structure appear to have been made at different times, with the weathering of the concrete and the style of the carving tool marks suggesting that at least 3 or 4 separate individuals contributed to the cluster over a period that extended from the initial construction phase in 1938 to 39 through at least one later addition that appears to date to the occupation period of 1940 to 44. This temporal layering suggests that the markings were not the product of a single episode, a single individual or group marking the bunker at a specific moment, but rather of an ongoing practice, a tradition in which successive visitors or occupants of the command post added to an existing set of markings in a recognizable idiom. If that interpretation is correct, it has significant implications for our understanding of what these markings represent. A practice that is transmitted between individuals over multiple years, in multiple locations, is not casual graffiti. It is a form of communication within a community, however small and informal that community might have been. The Mimoyecques site in the Pas-de-Calais, known to Second World War historians primarily as the location of the proposed Hochdruckpumpe, or V3 supergun installation, offers yet another dimension of the anomalous markings mystery because it combines several of the features we have seen at other sites in a single location of unusual strategic and historical significance. The V3 program was one of Germany's most ambitious and most secret vengeance weapons projects, an attempt to build a gun capable of firing shells from the French coast directly into central London at a rate of several hundred rounds per hour, using a system of multiple explosive charges arranged along the barrel to accelerate the projectile progressively rather than in a single explosion. The technology worked, at least in principle, as tests at Peenemünde demonstrated, but the engineering challenges of building a gun with a barrel long enough to achieve the required range while withstanding the stresses of repeated firing proved enormous. Organisation Todt broke ground at Mimoyecques in September 1943, beginning to excavate the hillside that would house the 50-metre gun shafts at the angles required to deliver fire on London. The Mimoyecques construction project was another major forced labour enterprise, using concentration camp prisoners alongside Organisation Todt's regular labour force. The site required not only the excavation of the gun shafts themselves, but the construction of a substantial underground infrastructure to house the machinery, ammunition, power supply and personnel necessary for sustained operation. By the time RAF Bomber Command attacked the site with the newly developed Tallboy deep penetration bombs in July 1944, Organisation Todt had excavated approximately 5 of the planned 25 gun shafts and had constructed a significant proportion of the associated underground infrastructure. The Tallboy bombs, weighing 12,000 pounds each and designed to penetrate to great depth before exploding, caused catastrophic damage to the facility's internal structure and killed a substantial number of the workers inside it. A second Tallboy raid in November 1944 completed the destruction, and the site was abandoned. The Mimoyecques complex has been accessible to researchers and visitors since the 1970s, and the systematic documentation of its internal markings began in the 1990s. What the documentation reveals is a site that in many respects parallels the Epilec blockhouse: administrative codes, personal inscriptions from the construction workforce in multiple languages and scripts, and a third category of anomalous markings that resist easy classification. The Mimoyecques anomalous markings have a characteristic that sets them apart from those at other sites, however. Several of them appear to be diagrams rather than symbols, drawn rather than carved, with lines and geometric forms that suggest schematic representation of something, rather than purely abstract or ritual marking. Some researchers have interpreted these diagram-like markings as engineering sketches, the informal working drawings that construction engineers make to communicate specific details without going through the formal drawing and approval process. That is a plausible interpretation for some of them, but others are too abstract and too geometrically regular to be convincingly explained as engineering sketches, and the locations where they appear on the walls of spaces that were used as personnel accommodation rather than as technical working areas make the engineering sketch explanation less persuasive. The possibility that some of the Mimoyecques diagram-like markings are sacred or ritual in character is suggested by their similarity to configurations found in a body of material that most people have never heard of, the geometric schemas produced by the SS Ahnenerbe in its investigations of what it claimed to be pre-Christian Germanic sacred architecture. The Ahnenerbe, whose full name was the Ahnenerbe Studiengesellschaft für Geistesurgeschichte, or Ancestral Heritage Research Society, spent years investigating what it believed to be the hidden geometric principles underlying the layout of ancient Germanic sites, including megalithic monuments, early medieval churches built on pagan foundations, and landscape formations that the Ahnenerbe researchers believed had been deliberately shaped by prehistoric Aryan peoples. The research produced a large body of material, much of it dubious in its scholarly methods, but interesting in its consistency and in the institutional commitment it represented. Specific geometric schemas recur throughout the Ahnenerbe's architectural research materials, and some of these schemas show a striking resemblance to the diagram-like markings at Mimoyecques and at other wartime construction sites. Is it possible that Ahnenerbe personnel were present at major OT construction sites and were applying their research schemas to the new structures being built? It seems unlikely on the face of it, since the Ahnenerbe was a research organisation rather than a construction supervisory body and had no obvious institutional role in OT projects. But the lines between SS organisations were often blurry, and Himmler's personal interest in sacred geometry could theoretically have resulted in informal involvement of Ahnenerbe-connected individuals in projects that Himmler considered particularly significant, which would include any project built under Hitler's direct personal interest, and Mimoyecques as a major V-weapon project certainly fell into that category. The evidence for Ahnenerbe involvement is circumstantial and inferential rather than direct, but it cannot be dismissed without more systematic access to the still incomplete Ahnenerbe documentary record. Heinrich Himmler's Wewelsburg Castle in Westphalia represents perhaps the most explicit intersection of Nazi power and neo-pagan ritual in the entire history of the Third Reich. The castle, which Himmler leased from the municipality of Büren in 1933 and subsequently developed into what he envisioned as the spiritual centre of the SS order, was the subject of an elaborate renovation and reconstruction program that consumed enormous resources throughout the Nazi period. Organisation Todt and various SS construction units worked on Wewelsburg continuously from the mid-1930s onward, and concentration camp prisoners were used for much of the physical labour in the later phases. The project was never completed, but what was accomplished included the North Tower with its famous underground Obergruppenführersaal, the room below the SS General's Hall that is still visible today, with its central fire pit and its domed ceiling, incorporating geometric designs derived from pre-Christian Germanic symbolism. The Wewelsburg is different from the other sites we have examined because the symbolic language used within it was official rather than anomalous. Himmler's vision for Wewelsburg was publicly known within the SS, at least to the senior officers who were the intended occupants of the General's Hall, and the geometric and runic designs in the finished spaces were deliberately chosen and officially executed as expressions of SS ideology rather than covertly applied by individual workers following a private tradition. The Wewelsburg therefore provides us with a useful baseline. It shows us what official SS sacred symbolism looked like when it was applied with official sanction and unlimited resources. And comparing that official SS symbolism to the anomalous markings found in other wartime installations reveals something important. The anomalous markings at Wolf's Lair, at Riese, at the West Wall bunkers, and at the other sites we have examined are not identical to the official Wewelsburg symbolism. They share some elements, some geometric forms, and some runic characters, but they diverge in significant ways, both adding elements not found at Wewelsburg and omitting elements that Wewelsburg makes central. This divergence suggests that whoever was making the anomalous markings in those other sites was not simply copying SS official symbolism, but was drawing on a related but distinct tradition, one that shared some sources with SS sacred geometry but was not identical to it. What might that related but distinct tradition have been? One answer, which a small number of researchers have been developing with increasing sophistication in recent years, involves looking at the specific occupational groups within the wartime German military that had both the access to restricted facilities and the cultural background to produce the kind of consistently unusual symbolic marking we have been documenting. Among those groups, one stands out as particularly significant: the German Military Engineering Corps, the Wehrmacht's Pioniere, and their Organisation Todt equivalents, who were the men actually responsible for the construction and maintenance of the fortifications we have been examining. German military engineers had a professional culture with deep roots in the pre-modern European tradition of military architecture, a tradition that had its own technical vocabulary, its own professional symbols and marks, and its own semi-private communication systems developed over centuries of practice. Medieval military engineers, like medieval cathedral builders, use marking systems to track their work, communicate with their colleagues, and claim professional ownership of specific contributions to a larger project. These marking systems evolved over time but never entirely disappeared, surviving as fragments of professional custom within the traditions of European military engineering through to the modern period. If any occupational group within the wartime German military had access to a pre-modern professional marking tradition that might produce consistent, deliberate, geometrically complex symbols in the walls of military fortifications, it was the military engineers and the Organisation Todt supervisors, who were often former military engineers or who had trained in traditions that included military engineering. This hypothesis has the advantage of explaining the geographical spread and temporal consistency of the anomalous markings, since military engineering professional culture would have been transmitted through training and professional socialization, rather than through geographical community, and could therefore produce similar marking practices in Norway and France, in Germany and Poland, in all the places where the same professional corps operated. It also has the advantage of explaining why the markings appear in technically significant locations, at structural junctions, at entrances to major spaces, in communications facilities, rather than being randomly distributed throughout the fortification systems. Engineers would have marked the points that were significant from an engineering perspective, not the points that were significant from an ideological or personal perspective. But this hypothesis too has its problems. Military engineering professional marking traditions of the kind invoked by this theory are not well documented for the German military specifically, and the geometric complexity of some of the anomalous markings exceeds what one would expect from a purely functional professional marking system. Some of the symbols, particularly those found at Riese and at the Wolf's Lair, have a quality of elaborateness and intentionality that suggests symbolic rather than purely technical purpose, and some of them incorporate runic elements that have no obvious technical meaning and no precedent in any documented engineering marking tradition, German or otherwise. We are, in other words, not yet at the end of this mystery. The more carefully the anomalous markings in wartime German fortifications are documented and studied, the more complex the picture becomes and the less adequate any single explanatory hypothesis turns out to be. What seems increasingly clear is that the markings reflect not one phenomenon but several overlapping ones: professional, engineering traditions, SS ideological symbolism in unofficial or idiosyncratic forms, worker graffiti from many different cultural traditions, and something else, something that appears specifically in the most restricted and significant spaces, and that has not yet been satisfactorily explained by any of the available hypotheses. The Atlantic Wall bunkers of Normandy, ground zero of the most consequential military operation of the entire war, have been among the most intensively documented of all wartime German fortifications, and they deserve special attention in our investigation, both because of their historical significance and because of the specific character of the anomalous markings found within them. The Normandy coast was fortified as part of the overall Atlantic Wall programme, but the specific character of the Normandy defences reflected the particular challenges of the terrain and the particular uncertainty about where and when the Allied invasion might come. The Normandy coast is a complex shoreline of beaches, headlands, river mouths and rocky outcrops, and the German defensive plan attempted to cover all of it with a combination of beach obstacles, minefields, artillery batteries and infantry positions in reinforced concrete bunkers and open field fortifications. The most famous of the Normandy German positions is Point du Hoc, the rocky headland between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach that was the objective of the U.S. Army Rangers' dramatic cliff assault on D-Day, June 6, 1944. The concrete bunkers and gun casemates at Point du Hoc, many of them cracked and tilted by the enormous volume of pre-invasion bombing and naval gunfire they absorbed, still stand on the headland and have been preserved as a memorial to the men who fought there. The interior surfaces of the Point du Hoc bunkers have been examined by researchers on multiple occasions, and they contain the expected mixture of German military inscriptions, post-combat markings added by American troops, and the scars of combat. But they also contain, in several sheltered interior spaces, a series of markings that predate the combat and that have not been satisfactorily explained. The Point du Hoc anomalous markings are among the most carefully photographed and analysed of any in the Normandy system, partly because of the site's prominence and the number of researchers who have worked there. They include a carved symbol in a concrete wall of one of the gun crew shelters that has been described as a variant of the Tiwaz rune, the T rune of the elder Futhark, associated with the Norse god Tyr, and with themes of justice, sacrifice and warfare. But the Point du Hoc version of this symbol has an additional element below the standard form, a horizontal bar at the base of the vertical stroke that creates a cross-like form not found in standard Tiwaz. This modified form appears to have been deliberately chosen rather than accidentally produced, since the additional bar is as carefully carved as the rest of the symbol. The Tiwaz rune was used by the SS in certain contexts, including as the emblem of some Waffen-SS units with a supposedly Germanic warrior identity, but the Point du Hoc version does not match any documented SS variant of the Tiwaz either. Adjacent to this symbol, carved apparently at a different time based on the weathering difference between the two markings, is a form that has proved even more difficult to classify. It is roughly circular with internal lines creating a pattern of radiating sections, and it has been compared to a variety of possible originals. A simplified wheel cross or sun wheel of the kind widely found in pre-Christian European symbolism, a compass rose, a navigation or orientation diagram, or a version of a symbol used in German folk magic traditions, the kind of protective mark that was applied to doors and walls in rural German communities well into the 19th century and in some areas even later. None of these identifications is compelling enough to have achieved consensus, and the combination of the two marks in the same confined space, the modified Tiwaz and the circular form, has led at least one researcher to suggest that they form a pair, that they are intended to be read together as components of a single composite symbol, and that understanding either one requires understanding both. The significance of paired or clustered anomalous markings is a theme that keeps returning in the literature on wartime German fortification symbols. At site after site, the anomalous markings do not appear in isolation but in groups, with individual symbols appearing close to others and in arrangements that suggest intentional composition rather than random accumulation. At the Wolf's Lair, the runic-like sequence in the communications bunker appears in a section of wall that also carries two other anomalous symbols of different types. At Riese, the elaborate entrance markings include at least 5 distinct symbol types arranged in a pattern that researchers have described as architectural in its spatial logic, as if the symbols were being deliberately placed in relationship to the geometry of the doorway they frame. At the West Wall survey site, the command post markings accumulate over time around a nucleus of earlier markings, as if successive contributors to the cluster were responding to and elaborating on what was already there. This consistently clustered and compositional quality of the anomalous markings suggests that whoever was making them understood themselves to be participating in something, a tradition, a practice, a conversation in symbols whose full meaning was accessible only to those who shared the underlying knowledge. This brings us to a possibility that is, frankly, more speculative than anything else we have considered, but that cannot be ignored in a complete treatment of the subject. Is it possible that some of the anomalous markings in wartime, German fortifications represent evidence of organized clandestine activity within the Nazi military apparatus? Germany during the war was not a monolithic block of ideological uniformity, however much Hitler and Goebbels tried to present it as such. There were resistance movements, however small and however brutally suppressed. There were individuals within the military who opposed the regime, ranging from the high-level conspiracy that produced the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt to lower-level acts of passive resistance and sabotage. There were also, less dramatically, various informal networks and communities within the German military and civilian population that maintained identities and practices that the Nazi state officially disapproved of, whether religious, fraternal, professional, or ideological. Any organized clandestine activity within the military would have needed communication systems, and any communication system operating within an environment of total surveillance, which the Nazi state aspired to, if it did not always achieve, would have benefited from methods of conveying information that were not recognizable as communication to outside observers. A system of symbols embedded in the physical fabric of military installations, invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking for, would be exactly the kind of communication medium that a clandestine network operating within the German military might have developed. This is not to say that such a network existed, or that such a network, if it existed, was responsible for the anomalous markings we have been examining. It is to say that the possibility cannot be ruled out, and that the consistent, widespread, deliberate and apparently systematic nature of the markings provides at least circumstantial grounds for taking it seriously. The V-Weapons program, which we have touched on through the Epilec and Mimoyecques sites, was one of the most compartmentalized and security-conscious programs of the entire Nazi war effort, and it generated its own rich body of anomalous markings that deserve consideration in their own right. The underground V2 production facility at Mittelwerk, carved into the Kohnstein mountain in Thuringia using concentration camp prisoners from the Dora Mittelbau camp, is one of the most extensively documented underground industrial sites of the Nazi era, and it has been the subject of systematic archaeological and historical investigation that has produced detailed maps of its tunnel system and extensive documentation of the markings found within it. Mittelwerk is in many ways the most extreme version of the forced labor experience that underlies so much of the wartime German construction program. The prisoners of Dora Mittelbau who excavated and equipped the tunnels of Mittelwerk died in enormous numbers, and the conditions they endured were among the worst in the concentration camp system. The physical evidence they left behind, inscribed in the walls of the tunnels and production bays where V2 rockets were assembled, includes some of the most heartbreaking prisoner graffiti in the entire catalogue of wartime German sites. But Mittelwerk also contains anomalous markings of the type we have been examining throughout this investigation, and they appear, as at other sites, specifically in the areas of the complex that were used by German supervisory and technical personnel, rather than by the prisoner workforce. The Mittelwerk anomalous markings are interesting for a specific reason that goes beyond their content. They appear in sections of the tunnel complex that were specifically associated with the technical oversight of the V2 production process, areas where German engineers, SS technical officers, and specialists from the A4 program, as the V2 was officially designated, supervised the prisoner workforce assembling the missiles. These areas were restricted to authorized personnel, which means that the markings found in them were made by a relatively small and relatively well-defined group of people, senior German technical and military personnel with specialized knowledge of the V2 program and with the access necessary to enter restricted production oversight areas. The markings they left are consistent with the anomalous marking tradition we have documented at other sites, suggesting that whoever was making those marks was part of a community that extended beyond any single site or project. Could that community have been the community of senior technical and scientific personnel who moved between the various components of the German secret weapons program? The V-weapons world was relatively small in personnel terms, with a core group of engineers and scientists headed by Wernher von Braun and his colleagues, who were involved in the program from its early experimental phase at Peenemünde through its operational deployment at Mittelwerk and other sites. These men moved between sites as the program developed, and they would have had access to restricted areas at all of the major V-weapons installations. If the anomalous marking tradition was embedded in this technical community, it could have spread from Peenemünde to Mittelwerk, from Epilec to Mimoyecques, carried by the same core personnel who were responsible for the technical oversight of the whole program. This would explain both the geographical consistency of the markings and their concentration in technically restricted spaces. But Wernher von Braun and his colleagues were primarily engineers and scientists, not mystics or occultists. They had a pragmatic, technical orientation that sat awkwardly with the runic and sacred geometric elements of the anomalous markings. Von Braun was a Protestant Christian who later in life became quite explicitly religious, and his colleagues were, for the most part, professional engineers without obvious connections to the kind of neo-pagan symbolism that the SS promoted. If the marking tradition within the V-weapons program had runic elements, those elements came from somewhere other than the engineering core of the program, suggesting either that the markings had multiple origins that became conflated in specific locations, or that the community responsible for them was not purely the scientific and engineering personnel, but included others, SS oversight personnel perhaps, who overlaid their own symbolic vocabulary on a pre-existing technical marking system. We have been moving through the physical landscape of the Nazi state's underground empire, from the Atlantic Wall to the Norwegian fjords, from the Riese complex to the V-weapons factories. But there is one more category of site that we have not yet examined, and it is in some ways the most interesting of all because it combines elements from all the other categories, while adding something that none of the others have: continued human occupation. After the war, the underground installations that were taken over by the Soviet military and then by the militaries of the Warsaw Pact states after 1945 were used continuously for decades, and they were used by people who had no particular reason to preserve or respect whatever symbolic language the original German occupants had left behind. The fact that some of the anomalous markings in those installations survived decades of Soviet and Eastern Bloc military use speaks to their physical durability, and in some cases to their physical inaccessibility in spaces that the post-war military users simply sealed off rather than incorporating into their own operations. It is those sealed spaces, reopened only after the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the withdrawal of Russian forces from Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and the other former Warsaw Pact states, that have yielded some of the most significant discoveries in the ongoing investigation of wartime German anomalous markings. And it is to one of those sealed spaces that we now turn in the final phase of our investigation. In the summer of 2004, a team of Polish archaeologists working in the area around Wewelsburg in Lower Silesia opened a section of the Riese tunnel complex that had been sealed by collapsing concrete since the Soviet occupation of the area in 1945. The section they unsealed had been inaccessible for nearly 60 years, and the condition of its interior surfaces, protected from moisture and human disturbance by the concrete seal, was remarkable. The markings on the walls of this sealed section, photographed under controlled conditions before any human activity could disturb them, turned out to be among the best preserved anomalous markings in the entire Riese complex, and they revealed details that the weathered and disturbed markings in the more accessible sections of the tunnel had not preserved. The most significant of the newly uncovered markings in this sealed section was a symbol on the left wall of the main tunnel, approximately 3 meters from the sealed entrance, at a height that placed it just above eye level for a person of average height. It was carved with a precision that the team's archaeologists described as exceptional for the context, meaning that it was much more carefully executed than the surrounding construction markings and personal inscriptions. The symbol itself consists of a central vertical axis from which branch pairs of lines at 3 different heights, creating a form that superficially resembles a stylized tree or plant. But the angles and proportions of the branching lines follow a geometric regularity that is not biological, but mathematical. And when measured precisely, the branching angles turn out to conform to a specific geometric ratio that one member of the survey team, working in a different context, recognized immediately. The geometric ratio in question is one that appears repeatedly in the Ahnenerbe research materials related to, what the SS researchers called Ur-Germanic sacred architecture, the supposed geometric principles underlying the layout of pre-Christian Germanic sacred sites. The specific ratio, which relates the length of the branch lines to the spacing between the branching points on the vertical axis, appears in at least 3 separate Ahnenerbe documents dealing with the geometric analysis of megalithic monuments in northern Germany and Scandinavia. This correspondence does not prove that the symbol in the sealed Riese section was made by an Ahnenerbe researcher or was consciously derived from Ahnenerbe materials. It does suggest that whoever made it was either working from the same source materials that the Ahnenerbe researchers used, or had a direct or indirect familiarity with the Ahnenerbe's geometric schemas. Given that the Riese project was among the most heavily SS-controlled construction enterprises of the wartime period, with SS-supervised concentration camp labour and SS administrative oversight, some degree of Ahnenerbe familiarity among the senior SS personnel present at the site is not implausible. Adjacent to this primary symbol, in the sealed section, are 3 smaller markings that have been more difficult to interpret. The first appears to be a sequence of characters rather than a single symbol, but the characters are not from any runic alphabet, elder or younger Futhark, Armanen, or otherwise that the survey team's runic specialist was able to identify. They are angular, like runes, but their specific forms do not correspond to any known runic character. The second small marking is geometric, a square subdivided into 9 equal sections by internal grid lines, with some sections marked and others left blank, creating what appears to be a binary pattern across the 9-cell grid. The 9-cell grid structure has been noted in other anomalous marking contexts and has been linked by some researchers to the concept of the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology, though this linkage is contested. The third small marking is the one that has attracted the most sustained attention from researchers. It appears to be a map, or at least a schematic representation of spatial relationships, with lines connecting a series of dots or nodes in a pattern that could represent either a geographical layout or a network structure of some kind. The possibility that some anomalous markings in wartime German fortifications are maps or spatial schematics is one that researchers have been reluctant to explore systematically, partly because the confirmation bias risks are obvious. If you look hard enough at any set of lines and dots, you will be able to see geographic resemblances, and the history of conspiracy theory is full of examples of people who have convinced themselves that random marks on walls are treasure maps or escape route guides. But the resealed section schematic is not a random arrangement of lines and dots. It has a precision and regularity that distinguishes it from casual marking, and when its spatial relationships are analysed mathematically, they do not produce a random distribution. The nodes are arranged in a pattern that has a definable structure, and the lines connecting them follow a consistent logic that is not immediately apparent, but that emerges under systematic geometric analysis. What the pattern represents, whether it is a geographical reference, a structural diagram, a network representation, or something else entirely, has not been determined. The fortifications of Poland's former German territories contain some of the most striking and least studied anomalous markings in the entire catalogue of wartime German sites, partly because their post-war inaccessibility under Soviet and Polish communist administration delayed systematic archaeological investigation by decades, and partly because the emotional and political complexity of the region's history, which encompasses the Holocaust, the German occupation, the Soviet conquest, and the subsequent decades of communist rule, has made dispassionate scholarly investigation difficult. But the work that has been done in the fortifications of former Pomerania, former East Prussia, and former Silesia has begun to reveal a remarkable concentration of anomalous markings that in some respects exceeds anything found in Western European sites. The Wolfschanze, Wolf's Lair, which we examined earlier in this investigation from the perspective of its overall history and its communications bunker markings, contains additional anomalous marking clusters that deserve further attention. Beyond the runic-like sequence in the communications area, the Wolf's Lair complex contains at least 2 other significant concentrations of anomalous markings that have been documented in the post-Soviet era. One of them is in a section of the complex that historians believe was associated with SS security personnel rather than with the Wehrmacht communications staff, and it includes markings that more closely resemble standard SS iconography, suggesting that SS personnel were indeed responsible for at least some portion of the Wolf's Lair anomalous marking tradition, even if they were not responsible for all of it. The other concentration is in a section whose original function has not been clearly established, a series of relatively small rooms in one of the secondary bunker buildings whose purpose the physical layout does not obviously indicate. In those rooms, covering much of one wall in the largest of the spaces, is an elaborate arrangement of carved symbols that includes both identifiable runic characters and unknown forms, arranged in a composition that researchers have described as the most elaborate and most deliberately executed piece of anomalous marking found anywhere in the Wolf's Lair complex. This elaborate wall composition at Wolf's Lair has been dated to the early operational period of the complex, approximately 1941 to 1942, based on the weathering of the concrete and the character of the carving. It was therefore made during the period when Hitler himself was present at the headquarters, when the facility was at the height of its operational intensity, and when access to the areas where the composition appears would have been restricted to a small number of authorized personnel. The people who made this marking, whatever it means, were people who were trusted to be in the inner circle of Hitler's operational headquarters at the critical early phase of the war in the East. They were senior enough to have access. They were confident enough to invest significant time and effort in making a mark on the wall of a restricted space in one of the most security-conscious installations in the world, and they were working in a symbolic vocabulary that does not match any officially sanctioned SS or Wehrmacht system. Who were they? This question has no definitive answer, and it may never have one. The people who made. Those markings are dead. The records that might have documented their identities and their intentions have mostly been destroyed. What we have is the physical evidence, and the physical evidence alone is not enough to reconstruct the complete story. But it is enough to tell us that something real was happening, that the anomalous markings in wartime German fortifications are not random, not accidental and not trivially explained, and that they represent a dimension of the Nazi state's physical and cultural legacy that historians have only begun to fully investigate. The post-war history of some of these bunker sites adds another layer of complexity to the story of their anomalous markings, because in some cases, the markings that we are examining today are not the only anomalous markings on those walls. Post-war visitors, including tourists, urban explorers, historians, and in some cases people with their own ideological agendas, have added to the inventory of markings at many of these sites, creating a palimpsest in which wartime original and post-war addition are sometimes difficult to distinguish. This is a methodological challenge for researchers, but it is also a cultural phenomenon in its own right. The bunkers of the Nazi state have attracted human-marking impulses in every era since the war, as if the concrete walls of those structures have a gravitational pull on anyone who enters them, an invitation to add something, to claim presence, to communicate something to whoever comes after. The neo-Nazi graffiti that occasionally appears at sites associated with the Third Reich is the most troubling of these post-war additions, representing a form of ideological vandalism that desecrates both the physical heritage and the human suffering associated with these places. But there are other, less ideologically charged post-war markings at these sites as well. Cold War-era military inscriptions from the forces that occupied the sites after 1945. Explorer. Markers added by urban adventurers who have penetrated restricted spaces, and scholarly notation added by researchers conducting surveys. The task of separating these layers is painstaking and requires expertise in both the physical analysis of surface weathering and the historical knowledge of what different marking traditions look like in concrete and stone. It is work that is ongoing, and that will continue for as long as there are scholars willing to spend time in the damp, dark corridors of buildings that were built for war and that the war left behind. The Channel Islands fortifications have undergone particularly significant recent investigation, driven partly by the island's heritage tourism industry and partly by the growing recognition among historians that the occupation experience of those islands, unique in the British Isles, deserves systematic scholarly attention. The Jersey War tunnels, officially known as Holgangsanlage 8 or HO8, are the most extensively documented of the Channel Islands' underground installations, having been preserved and open to visitors as a museum that has attracted considerable scholarly interest in addition to its many tourist visitors. The marking survey conducted within the HO8 tunnel system over several years in the 2000s produced one of the most comprehensive datasets of its kind, cataloguing more than 400 individual markings and subjecting each of them to systematic analysis. The results of that survey have not yet been fully published, but preliminary findings that have been shared at academic conferences and in specialist publications paint an interesting picture. The majority of the HO8 markings are as expected. Cyrillic inscriptions from Soviet and other Eastern European prisoners who worked on construction of the tunnel, Organisation Todt administrative codes, Wehrmacht garrison inscriptions, and post-war additions from various sources. But the anomalous marking category, comprising roughly 8% of the total, is proportionally larger than at most comparable sites and includes some of the most elaborate examples of the type found anywhere in the Channel Islands fortification system. Several of these anomalous markings appear in sections of the tunnel that were reportedly used for the storage of materials and equipment by the German garrison. Areas that would have been accessible only to authorized personnel and that saw little or no contact with the prisoner workforce that built the tunnels. In those garrison storage areas, among the shelves and brackets and administrative markings of a military storage facility, someone carved a set of symbols that the HO8 survey team classified as complex and unattributed. The symbols include forms that the team's specialist advisor described as consistent with a late Iron Age Germanic symbolic tradition, meaning forms that predate the Christian period in Northern Europe and that were associated with a pre-Christian religious and social world. The same advisor noted that these forms had been selectively incorporated into SS iconography during the Nazi period, which was the more likely immediate source for a German soldier in a wartime garrison, but that the specific configurations in which they appear at HO8 do not match known SS usage, and in some cases appear to reflect an older or less systematized version of the symbolic tradition than the SS standardized version. This is an observation that supports the hypothesis, advanced by several researchers, that the anomalous marking tradition in wartime German fortifications draws on sources that predate and are independent of SS runic ideology, even where it overlaps with that ideology in its surface appearance. The discovery in 2019 of a previously unknown sealed chamber within the fortification complex at La Coupole in the Pas-de-Calais generated significant attention in French heritage and archaeological circles, and for good reason. La Coupole, named for its distinctive concrete dome, was another of the massive V-weapons preparation sites built by Organisation Todt in northern France, in this case intended as a storage and launch facility for V2 rockets rather than V3 superguns. Like Epilec and Mimoyecques, it was subjected to RAF bombing, damaged but not destroyed, and then abandoned as Allied forces advanced through the region in 1944. It has been preserved as a museum and research site, and its physical fabric has been repeatedly surveyed. But the 2019 discovery demonstrated that even intensively studied sites can conceal significant undocumented spaces, and the markings found in the sealed chamber at La Coupole have proved to be among the most discussed anomalous discoveries of recent years. The sealed chamber was found during repair work on one section of the dome structure when a section of post-war concrete in fill that had been assumed to be structural turned out to conceal a sealed doorway. The chamber behind it, roughly 4 meters by 6 meters and apparently used as a technical storage or equipment space, had been completely sealed since the German evacuation in 1944 and contained a collection of objects and markings in remarkable preservation. The objects, which included technical documentation that has been valuable to historians of the V-weapons program, were quickly catalogued and transferred to appropriate archival custody. The markings on the chamber walls are another matter. The La Coupole sealed chamber markings include examples of all the categories we have discussed: administrative codes, personal inscriptions, and a group of anomalous symbols that have attracted the most sustained attention. But they also include something that has not been found, or at least not reported, at any other wartime German site: a text. Not a graffiti inscription, not a code, not a symbolic composition, but what appears to be a passage of running text in a language and script that the initial examination could not identify. The text is written in a neat, careful hand using a paint or ink that has survived in the sealed, dry conditions of the chamber. It runs for approximately 3 lines, and while the individual characters have been photographed and shared with specialists in historical scripts and languages, no identification has yet been published that has achieved scholarly consensus. The proposals that have been advanced include Gothic script, an archaic form of German writing that had largely fallen out of use by the 20th century, but that some NS ideologues had promoted as a form of authentic Germanic cultural expression. A version of Elder Futhark runes rendered in a way that simulates running text rather than individual isolated symbols. A cipher text using an alphabetic substitution key that has not been recovered. And more adventurously, a script from one of the less well-documented European written traditions of the early medieval period that might theoretically have been known to a scholar with very specific historical interests. None of these proposals has been convincingly demonstrated, and the possibility that the La Coupole text represents a genuinely unknown script cannot currently be ruled out, though most specialists consider this less likely than the possibility of a known script rendered in an unfamiliar way. What can be said about the La Coupole text is that its very existence in that sealed chamber represents a challenge to the existing framework of explanations for anomalous markings in wartime German fortifications. A 3-line text, carefully written in a sealed storage chamber at one of the most security-controlled sites in the German war economy, goes well beyond what can be explained by casual graffiti, professional marking traditions, or even deliberate ritual symbolism. Someone went to the trouble of writing something in that chamber, something that they wrote carefully enough to take several lines, and they wrote it in a form that was either deliberately obscure or that reflects a knowledge base that has not yet been matched to any of the individuals we know to have been associated with the La Coupole site. This is the kind of discovery that forces researchers to reconsider the framework they have been working within, and the La Coupole text has indeed prompted a reconsideration of some of the assumptions that have guided the study of wartime German anomalous markings. Perhaps the most significant reconsideration is the one that concerns the audience for these markings. Throughout this investigation, we have been assuming implicitly that the anomalous markings in wartime German fortifications were produced by people who expected that other people who shared their knowledge would read them. This is the assumption that underlies the clandestine communication hypothesis, the professional marking tradition hypothesis, and even the ritual symbolism hypothesis. In each case, the marks are assumed to be marks communicative, directed at someone who had the knowledge to receive and interpret them. But there is another possibility that the La Coupole text, with its apparent deliberateness and its careful execution in a sealed chamber, brings into focus the possibility that some of these marks were made not to communicate with other people, but to communicate with the future or even beyond the future, in a tradition of marking that is not fundamentally communicative in the ordinary sense, but memorial or prophylactic or invocatory, marks that are made not to be read but to exist. This is a kind of marking that is very old. It appears in prehistoric cave art, where some researchers have argued that the act of making the mark was more important than the possibility of anyone seeing it. It appears in architectural traditions across many cultures, where symbolic marks are embedded in foundations or concealed within walls during construction, intended to protect the structure or its occupants in ways that do not depend on anyone ever finding or reading them. If some proportion of the anomalous markings in wartime German fortifications belong to this tradition of marks made for their own sake rather than for any communicative purpose, then the question of what they mean in the sense of what they were intended to communicate is the wrong question to be asking. The right question in that case is why someone felt the need to make those marks in those places at that time. What understanding of the world, what relationship to the physical fabric of these massive concrete structures would lead a person to carve a symbol into the wall of a sealed chamber at La Coupole, or onto the entrance surround of the Riese complex's main hall, or into the concrete of a gun crew shelter at Pointe de Hoc? The wartime German state was not a society in which mysticism and technology coexisted comfortably. The Nazi regime promoted a pseudo-scientific racial ideology that was supposed to supersede what it dismissed as the superstitions of the Christian tradition and the decadent mysticism of the modern occult movement, while simultaneously indulging in its own elaborate pseudo-mystical rituals, symbolism, and ceremonies that were mystical in everything but name. The SS was the most extreme expression of this contradiction, combining the apparatus of a modern bureaucratic security organization with the aesthetic vocabulary of a medieval knightly order and the ideological content of a racial pseudo-religion. The people who built and occupied the fortifications we have been examining lived within this contradiction, and the marks they left behind reflect it. Some of those marks are crisply functional, some are straightforwardly personal, some are identifiably ideological, and some belong to a category that exists precisely in the tension between the modern and the archaic, the rational and the ritual, the functional and the symbolic, a category that we can observe and document, but that we have not yet fully understood. 8 decades after the end of the Second World War, with the last surviving eyewitnesses gone and the documentary record largely fixed, the anomalous markings in wartime German fortifications represent one of the few categories of evidence about that period that is still actively producing new information. Every survey of a previously unstudied site, every reopening of a sealed chamber, every application of new imaging technologies to known markings potentially adds to the dataset. The German academic institutions that have primary responsibility for the wartime heritage sites in the former Reich territory have in recent years developed more systematic approaches to documenting and analysing anomalous markings, moving beyond the site-by-site approach that dominated earlier research toward a comparative framework that can identify patterns across sites and generate testable hypotheses about their origin and meaning. Similar programs are developing in France, Norway, Poland and the Channel Islands. The field is young but growing, and the questions it is asking are fundamental ones about the human experience of the most terrible and most consequential conflict in history. What were the people who carved those symbols into bunker walls trying to say? Were they marking territory, invoking protection, communicating with colleagues, following professional tradition, expressing personal belief, or doing something so individual and so specific to their moment in history that no general category can capture it? The honest answer is that we do not know, and that not knowing is part of what makes these marks so powerful. They are the evidence of minds we cannot fully reconstruct, working in a system of meaning we cannot fully access, leaving traces in concrete that has outlasted the world that produced them. The bunkers of the Third Reich were built to last 1,000 years, which was how long Hitler said his Reich would endure. The Reich lasted 12 years. The bunkers are still here, and so are the marks on their walls, waiting for someone to understand them. The ongoing investigation of wartime German fortification markings is not just an exercise in archaeological curiosity. It connects to fundamental questions about how human beings mark their presence in the world, how symbols and symbol systems are transmitted across communities and time, how even the most technologically sophisticated and ideologically totalitarian societies cannot entirely erase the impulse toward private and personal marking that seems to be part of the deep structure of human consciousness. Every bunker wall covered in anomalous symbols is also a record of individuality persisting within a system designed to subordinate the individual to the collective, of personal expression surviving in an environment of surveillance and control, of meaning-making continuing even in the most extreme and brutal of circumstances. The researchers who document those markings are performing an act of recovery that goes beyond archaeology. They are recovering the evidence that individual human beings were present in those concrete spaces, that they thought and felt and believed things that they encoded in marks that they perhaps hoped would outlast them, and that those marks have indeed outlasted them, though the meanings encoded in them are still being recovered. It is slow work. It is often frustrating work, and it is work that cannot be completed by any single researcher or any single generation of researchers because the sites are too numerous, the markings too varied, and the cultural context too complex for any individual or team to master. But it is work that matters because the bunkers of the Second World War are among the most extensive and most complex physical records of the worst chapter in modern human history, and the marks on their walls are part of that record. Every symbol we understand is a fragment of history recovered. Every symbol that remains unexplained is a reminder that the past keeps its own secrets, and that some of those secrets are stranger than anything we might have imagined. The oldest fortifications of the Atlantic Wall, the Channel Islands, and the Polish underground complexes are not simply relics of military history. They are the physical residue of a world in which millions of people, soldiers and prisoners, engineers and occupiers, believers in terrible things and quiet resistors of those beliefs, lived and worked and suffered and in some cases died. The marks they left on those walls are the most personal and most direct evidence of their individual presence that we have, and the marks that we cannot yet read are not failures of our investigation. They are invitations to keep looking, keep asking, and keep open the possibility that the past has more to tell us than we currently know how to hear. Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the hidden markings of the oldest and most mysterious wartime bunkers on Earth. We have travelled from the cliffs of Normandy to the fjords of Norway, from the Channel Islands to the underground complexes of Poland, and everywhere we have looked we have found evidence that the concrete walls of the Nazi state recorded more than the military architects who designed them ever intended. If you found this investigation as fascinating as we did, make sure to check out our video on the Riese complex and the lost treasures of the Third Reich's underground empire, where we go even deeper into the mysteries buried beneath the Owl Mountains. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the hidden history of World War II. See you in the next one.